The searing pain of the hot iron against her skin would forever be etched in Penelope Kincaid's memory, just as the mark it left was branded into her flesh. As she ran through the darkness of the Colorado night, the distant howl of hounds propelled her forward despite her exhaustion. 3 days she'd been running, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the determination to never again be called property. The year was 1871, and the war that had supposedly freed those in bondage felt like nothing but a distant rumor to Penelope. Born to an enslaved mother on a plantation in Mississippi, she had been sold westward after the war to a man who claimed to need domestic help, but treated her no differently than a slave. Jeremiah Blackstone had been cruel from the start, but when she'd attempted to leave his ranch outside Winslow, Arizona territory, he decided to mark her permanently as her lungs burned as she stumbled along the rocky terrain, each step taking her farther from Blackstone's ranch. The sound of water ahead gave her hope perhaps she could throw the hounds off her scent. As she approached the stream, her foot caught on a hidden root, sending her tumbling down the embankment. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed at the bottom. "I'll die before I go back," she whispered to herself, trying to stand but collapsing under the weight of her injured ankle. The barking grew louder. Time was running out. The thundering of hooves broke through the night sounds. Penelope pressed herself against the ground, praying whoever approached wasn't one of Blackstone's men. The horse stopped somewhere above her on the embankment. "Hello, is someone down there?" A man's voice called out. Penelope remained silent, weighing her options. The hounds were getting closer. "I know you're there. I heard you fall," the voice continued. "I'm not looking for trouble." "Neither am I," she finally answered, her voice cracking from thirst and exhaustion. A tall figure slid down the embankment, moving carefully in the moonlight. As he approached, she could see he wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a rifle slung across his back. His boots stopped just a few feet from her. "You hurt?" he asked, crouching down. "My ankle," she admitted, seeing no point in lying. "And they're coming for me." "Who's coming?" "Blackstone's men with dogs." The stranger stood suddenly, listening to the distant barking. "That's Blackstone's hunting pack, all right. I know the sound." He looked down at her again. "What's your name?" Penelope Kincaid. "I'm Roy Xavier. Most folks call me Roy X." He extended his hand. "Can you stand, Miss Kincaid?" She tried, but winced in pain. Without hesitation, Roy scooped her up in his arms and began climbing back up the embankment. "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling against his hold. "Saving your life if you'll let me," he answered simply. "Blackstone's not known for his forgiveness." At the top, a magnificent chestnut horse waited patiently. Roy placed her carefully in the saddle before mounting behind her. "Why would you help me?" she asked as he urged the horse forward, away from the sound of the hounds. "Because no person has the right to own another," he said, "and I've never much liked Jeremiah Blackstone." As they rode through the darkness, Penelope remained tense, expecting at any moment for Roy to reveal his true intentions. Men didn't help women like her without expecting something in return. "Relax," he said after a while. "We've got a long ride ahead. There's a place I know, a cabin about 20 miles from here. We can rest there, see to that ankle." "And then what?" she asked. "And then you decide what you want to do. You're free with me, Miss Kincaid." The words struck her like a physical blow. Free. She hadn't been truly free a day in her life. "He branded me," she whispered, the shame of it burning hotter than the wound itself. "Like cattle." Roy's arms tightened slightly around her as he held the reins. "That mark doesn't make you his. It just proves what kind of monster he is." They rode in silence after that, the rhythmic gait of the horse nearly lulling Penelope to sleep, despite her circumstances. The first hints of dawn were breaking over the distant mountains when Roy finally slowed the horse. "There it is," he said, pointing to a small cabin nestled among the pines. "Not much to look at, but it's safe." The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a small corral for the horse and a creek running nearby. Roy helped her down and carried her inside, setting her gently on a wooden chair while he lit a lamp. "Let me look at that ankle," he said, kneeling before her. As he carefully removed her boot, Penelope studied him. Roy Xavier was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His hands were calloused but gentle as they examined her swollen ankle. Sprained, not broken, he announced. You're lucky. Lucky. She repeated with a bitter laugh. He looked up at her, his eyes serious. Yes, Lucky, you got away from Blackstone. Not everyone does. You know him well. Roy stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, retrieving bandages and a bottle. Well enough to know what he's capable of. I used to ride for the Circle B years ago before he showed his true colors. He returned and began wrapping her ankle. This will help with the swelling, but you'll need to stay off it for a few days. I can't stay here, she protested. He'll keep looking. Not here, he won't. This place isn't on any map, and Blackstone doesn't know about it. It belonged to my partner, Jim. He's gone now, but he left it to me. After bandaging her ankle, Roy brought her water and some dried meat from his saddlebags. It's not much, but I'll go hunting later. You should rest. Exhaustion won out over caution, and Penelope soon found herself drifting to sleep on the small bed in the corner while Roy took a position in a chair by the door, rifle across his lap. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, streaming through the cabin's single window. Roy was gone, but a note sat on the table next to a plate of food. Gone hunting. Stay inside. Be back by sunset. Penelope ate the food, cornbread and some kind of stew, then tested her ankle. It was still painful, but the swelling had gone down. She explored the cabin, finding it sparsely furnished but clean. Books lined a small shelf, surprising her. She picked one up, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and began to read, losing herself in the story until she heard hoofbeats outside. She quickly returned the book and looked for something to use as a weapon. Grabbing a heavy iron skillet just as the door opened, Roy entered, carrying a brace of rabbits. He stopped when he saw her stance. Planning on cooking those rabbits or using that skillet on me? He asked with a slight smile. Penelope lowered the skillet, embarrassed. I wasn't sure it was you. Smart to be cautious, he said, hanging his hat on a peg. How's the ankle? Better, thank you. He nodded and began preparing the rabbits for cooking. Penelope watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. You can read, he said suddenly, nodding toward the book she'd left open on the table. My mother taught me, she said defensively. She worked in the big house. The mistress taught her and she taught me in secret. Roy nodded. My mother was a school teacher. She thought everyone should know how to read, regardless of their circumstances. He paused. You're welcome to any of the books while you're here. As the days passed, Penelope's ankle healed and a cautious trust began to form between them. Roy taught her to shoot his spare revolver, insisting she needed to know how to protect herself. You're a natural, he said after she hit 3 bottles in a row from the cabin porch. My father was a marksman in the war, she said, then caught herself. At least, that's what my mother told me. I never knew him. Roy didn't press, just nodded and showed her how to clean the gun. A week into her stay, as they sat by the fire after supper, Roy finally asked about the brand. You don't have to tell me, he said when she stiffened, but I've seen enough to know it's recent. Penelope stared into the flames. 3 weeks ago, I told him I was leaving. I'd saved enough from what little he paid me to get to California, I thought. She paused, swallowing hard. I thought I was free, that the war had made me free. You are, Roy said firmly. Blackstone didn't think so. He caught me packing my things. Had his men hold me down while he heated the iron. Said if I was so determined to leave, he'd make sure everyone knew who I belonged to. Her fingers unconsciously moved to her shoulder, where the crude bee was still healing beneath her clothing. Roy's jaw tightened, but his voice remained controlled. How did you get away? Waited until they were all drunk celebrating a cattle sale. Took me 3 weeks to work up the courage. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. When I was 16, Roy finally said, I saw a man hanged for stealing a horse. Only he hadn't stolen it, it was his horse. But he was Cherokee and the man who accused him was white. Nobody questioned it. He poked at the fire. That's when I realized justice isn't natural, it's something people have to fight for. Is that why you helped me? For justice? Roy considered this. Partly. And partly because when I saw you there by that stream, I couldn't walk away. The next morning, Penelope was washing dishes when Roy entered the cabin with a grim expression. Riders coming, he said, checking his gun. Not sure who, but better safe than sorry. There's a cellar under the rug. Hide there until I call for you. Heart pounding, Penelope followed his instructions, slipping into the dark space beneath the cabin floor. Through the cracks in the boards, she could see Roy greeting 3 men who entered the cabin. "Been a while, Xavier," one of them said. "Thought you'd left these parts." "Just keeping to myself," Roy answered casually. "What brings you boys out this way? Looking for a runaway," another man said. "Negro woman belongs to Jeremiah Blackstone. Seen anyone fitting that description?" "Can't say that I have," Roy replied. "Not many folks pass through here, especially not alone. Blackstone's offering $100 to anyone who brings her back alive," the first man said. "200 if she's unharmed. Appreciate the information," Roy said, "but I haven't seen her." The men lingered, accepting the coffee Roy offered, asking questions about the area. Penelope remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, they left, and Roy waited a full hour before opening the cellar. "They're gone," he said, helping her up. "But they'll be back, or others will. Blackstone won't give up easily." "Then I should leave," Penelope said. "I'm putting you in danger." "You're not going anywhere alone," Roy said firmly. "We'll leave together. I have friends in Colorado. We can make it there in a week or so if we're careful." "Why would you do that?" "Risk everything for a stranger." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because I'm tired of men like Blackstone thinking they can own people and land, and everything else they set their eyes on. Or maybe because you're not a stranger anymore, Penelope." That night, they packed what they could carry and left before dawn, heading northeast toward Colorado. They traveled by night when possible, avoiding main roads and settlements. By day, they hid in groves of trees or rocky outcroppings, taking turns keeping watch. During these quiet hours, they talked. Roy told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who died in a mining accident, about riding with a Texas cattle outfit before coming to Arizona. Penelope shared stories of her mother's quiet resistance, of learning to read by candlelight, of dreams she'd had of a different life. On the third night, as they made camp in a protected canyon, Roy noticed Penelope shivering despite the fire. "Here," he said, offering his coat. As he draped it around her shoulders, his fingers brushed against the brand through her thin shirt. She flinched away. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to. It's not you," she interrupted. I hate that it's there, that I'll carry his mark forever." Roy sat beside her. "My grandmother was Cherokee," he said. "She used to say scars are just stories written on our skin. They tell where we've been, not where we're going." Penelope looked at him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. "Where are we going, Roy Xavier, really?" "To freedom," he answered simply. "Yours, at least, after that. It's your choice." A week later, they crossed into Colorado territory. The air was cooler here, the mountains more imposing than the desert they'd left behind. Roy led them to a small mining town called Silver Creek, nestled in a valley between towering peaks. "My friend Thomas runs the livery here," Roy explained as they approached the town. "He'll help us." Thomas Miller was a broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh who welcomed Roy with a hearty embrace. His smile dimmed slightly when Roy explained Penelope's situation, but he offered them shelter without hesitation. "Got a room above the stable," he said. "Not fancy, but it's clean, and no one will bother you there." For the first time in weeks, Penelope slept in a real bed, with clean sheets and without the constant fear of discovery. The next morning, she woke to find new clothes simple but sturdy laid outside her door. "Thomas's wife sent them," Roy explained when she emerged dressed in the fresh garments. "She thought you might need them." "That's very kind," Penelope said, touching the fabric of her new skirt. "How can I repay them?" "No need," Thomas said, entering the stable. "Any friend of Roy's is welcome here," he hesitated. "But I should warn you both, there's talk of men asking questions over in Leadville. Looking for a woman matching your description, Miss Kincaid." Roy's expression hardened. "Blackstone's reach is long." "You can't stay here," Thomas said regretfully. "Too many people pass through, someone would talk eventually." "We'll move on," Roy assured him. "Just need supplies and a day's rest." That evening, as Penelope helped Thomas's wife, Martha, prepare supper, the older woman studied her thoughtfully. "Roy's a good man," Martha said as they kneaded bread dough. "Best I've known next to Thomas." "Yes," Penelope agreed. "I owe him my life," Martha smiled knowingly. I think it might be more than gratitude I see in your eyes when you look at him. Penelope kept her gaze firmly on the dough. He saved me, that's all. Of course, Martha said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Just remember, good men are rare in these parts. If you find one, don't let him go because you're afraid. Later, as they sat around the table eating, Thomas unfolded a map. There's a place about 3 days' ride from here, he said, pointing to a spot near the Continental Divide. Old mining cabin, abandoned now but still solid, remote enough that Blackstone's men won't find you easily. What about supplies? Roy asked. Winter's coming. Town called Winslow isn't far, couple days' ride when the weather's good, small enough that strangers are noticed but big enough to get what you need. Roy looked at Penelope. What do you think? She was surprised by the question. Men rarely asked for her opinion. If you think it's safe, then I trust your judgment. It's not my judgment that matters, Roy said. It's your life. The simple acknowledgement of her autonomy moved her more than any grand gesture could have. Then yes, she said, let's try it. 2 days later, they set out with fresh horses and supplies, following Thomas's directions into the high country. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner as they climbed. Pine forests gave way to aspen groves, their leaves beginning to turn gold with the approaching autumn. The cabin sat on a plateau overlooking a valley, with mountains rising behind it. A small creek ran nearby and meadows stretched out below, dotted with wildflowers despite the season. It's beautiful, Penelope breathed as they approached. Roy smiled at her expression. Different from Arizona, that's for sure. The cabin was crude but solid, with a stone fireplace and sturdy walls. It had been built to withstand mountain winters, with small, high windows and a loft for sleeping. They spent the remainder of the day cleaning, making repairs, and settling in. As night fell, they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching stars appear in the vast mountain sky. Do you think they'll find us here? Penelope asked, voicing the fear that had never quite left her. I think we're as safe as we can be, Roy answered honestly. And I think eventually Blackstone will decide you're not worth the trouble. What if he doesn't? Roy was quiet for a moment. Then we'll keep moving. Canada maybe, or California like you planned. She asked softly. He looked at her then, his expression unguarded. Unless you'd rather go alone, I'd understand. No, she said quickly. I wouldn't rather that at all. The days turned into weeks as autumn fully claimed the mountains. They established a routine. Roy hunted and chopped wood, while Penelope tended a small garden of hardy vegetables Thomas's wife had sent with them. Together they preserved food for the winter, smoked meat, gathered berries, and dried herbs that grew wild in the meadows. Every few weeks, Roy would ride to Winslow for supplies they couldn't provide themselves: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition. Each time he left, Penelope would stand at the window, watching until he disappeared from view, and each time he returned, the relief she felt grew stronger. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, they sat before the fire, Roy mending a bridle while Penelope darned socks. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. I never thought I'd have this, she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Roy looked up. Have what? Peace, she said simply. A place where I don't have to be afraid. He set aside his work. You deserve that and more, Penelope. She met his gaze across the small space. So do you, Roy. Something shifted between them that night, a recognition of feelings that had been growing since that first meeting by the stream. Neither acted on it immediately, but the awareness was there, changing the air around them like the coming snow changed the landscape outside. As winter settled fully over the mountains, they were snowed in for days at a time. They read aloud from Roy's small collection of books, played cards, and told stories. Roy taught Penelope to whittle, and she taught him songs her mother had sung when she was a child. On Christmas Eve, Roy presented her with a small wooden box he'd carved himself. Inside was a silver pendant in the shape of a bird taking flight. It's beautiful, she whispered, touching it reverently. I saw it in Winslow last month, he explained. Reminded me of you. She looked at him questioningly. Free, he said, determined to fly. That night, as snowflakes swirled outside the cabin windows, Penelope made her choice. She crossed the room to where Roy sat and gently took his face in her hands. I've never been allowed to choose before, she said softly. Not who to love, not where to go, not even what to call myself. Roy remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. And now I choose you, she said, and kissed him. His response was immediate, his arms encircling her, drawing her close as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. When they finally parted, breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. I've been waiting for you to be ready, he admitted. I didn't want you to think I expected anything in return for helping you. I know, she said. That's part of why I love you. The winter nights were no longer cold as they shared the bed in the loft, finding in each other a passion neither had known before. By day, they planned for spring, for a future together that once would have seemed impossible. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the meadows, Roy rode to Winslow for supplies. He returned with news that made Penelope's blood run cold. Blackstone's men were there, he said grimly. 3 of them, asking questions about newcomers to the area. Penelope sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Did anyone tell them about us? I don't think so. We've been careful. But it's only a matter of time before someone connects me to Thomas or remembers seeing me in town. Then we have to leave, she said, already rising to pack their belongings. Roy caught her hand. There's something else, something I've been thinking about. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold band. I got this in town too, before I knew about Blackstone's men. Penelope stared at the ring, understanding dawning slowly. I want you to be my wife, Penelope, not because it's safer though it is, but because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you. Tears filled her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. 2 days later, they stood before a circuit preacher in a small church in Winslow, exchanging vows as husband and wife. Thomas and Martha stood as witnesses, beaming with approval. Mrs. Penelope Xavier, Martha said afterward, embracing her, it has a fine sound to it. They spent one night at the hotel in town, Roy insisting his bride deserved at least one night in a proper bed, before preparing to leave the next morning. Their plan was to head west to California, where Blackstone's influence wouldn't reach. As they loaded their horses outside the hotel, a voice froze them both. Well now, ain't this touching? Penelope turned slowly to see 3 men approaching, the leader a tall, robined man with cold eyes and a star on his chest. Marshal, Roy acknowledged warily. Something we can help you with. I believe you have something that belongs to Jeremiah Blackstone, the marshal said, his eyes fixed on Penelope. He's offering a substantial reward for her return. She doesn't belong to anyone, Roy said firmly, moving to stand between Penelope and the men. She's my wife, the marshal snorted. A piece of paper don't change the fact that she's stolen property. Blackstone's got the papers proving it. Those papers are worthless, Roy said. The war ended slavery, she's a free woman. That's for a judge to decide, the marshal said, reaching for his gun. Now step aside, Xavier. What happened next unfolded in a blur. As the marshal drew his weapon, Thomas appeared from the livery stable, shotgun in hand. That's far enough, Peterson, he called. The marshal hesitated, looking between Thomas and Roy, who had his own hand hovering near his revolver. You're outnumbered, Peterson, Roy said calmly, and you're on the wrong side of the law. The 13th Amendment makes it pretty clear where things stand. Blackstone's got friends in high places, the marshal warned, but his confidence was wavering. So do we, Thomas said, nodding toward the growing crowd of townspeople gathering around them, many armed. Among them stood Mayor Harrison, a dignified older man who had performed their marriage ceremony the day before. What seems to be the trouble, Marshal? He asked, approaching the standoff. These folks are harboring a runaway, Peterson explained, gesturing toward Penelope. Property of Jeremiah Blackstone from Arizona Territory. Mayor Harrison raised his eyebrows. Property? I believe I just performed a wedding ceremony for Mrs. Xavier yesterday. Last I checked, citizens can't be property. Blackstone has papers, the marshal began. Any papers claiming ownership of another human being are null and void in the United States, the mayor interrupted firmly. Has been since 1865. Or did that news not reach you yet, Marshal Peterson? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Peterson looked around, realizing he was losing control of the situation. Now, the mayor continued, "I suggest you and your men move along. Mr. and Mrs. Xavier are upstanding citizens of this community, and we take care of our own in Winslow." For a tense moment, it seemed the marshal might resist. Then, slowly, he holstered his weapon. "Blackstone won't be happy," he warned. "Blackstone isn't here," Roy pointed out, "and if he shows his face in Winslow, he'll find himself answering for the crime of branding another human being." The marshal and his men retreated, mounting their horses and riding out of town to scattered jeers from the townspeople. As the crowd dispersed, Mayor Harrison approached Roy and Penelope. "I meant what I said," he told them. "You're welcome here in Winslow. The town could use good people like you both." Roy looked at Penelope, a question in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Mayor," Roy said. "We might just take you up on that." In the weeks that followed, they decided to stay in Winslow after all. Roy took a job at Thomas's livery, eventually becoming a partner in the business. Penelope, with Martha's encouragement, opened a small school, teaching reading and writing to the children of miners and shopkeepers alike. They bought land on the outskirts of town, building a proper house with wide windows and a wraparound porch. Each night, Penelope would stand on that porch and look at the mountains, marveling at how far she had come from that terrified woman running through the Arizona darkness. Word reached them eventually that Jeremiah Blackstone had died in a dispute over cards, shot by a gambler who claimed Blackstone had cheated. Neither Penelope nor Roy mourned him. "Does it make me a terrible person?" Penelope asked as they sat on their porch one evening. "That I feel nothing but relief knowing he's gone." Roy took her hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band on her finger. "It makes you human. He hurt you. You're allowed to be glad he can't hurt anyone else." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find this has all been a dream, that I'm still at his ranch, still owned." "You were never property," Roy said firmly. "No matter what he did to you. That brand," he touched her shoulder gently, where the scar remained, faded but still visible. "It marked his cruelty, not your worth." A year after they settled in Winslow, Penelope gave birth to their son, James Thomas Xavier, named for Roy's former partner and their faithful friend. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah Martha joined the family, completing their happiness. As the children grew, Roy and Penelope made sure they understood their heritage, the courage of their grandmother who had taught her daughter to read by candlelight, the Cherokee wisdom that had guided their father, and the fight for freedom that had brought their parents together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Roy surprised Penelope with a special gift. He had commissioned an artist to design a new brand for their small herd of cattle, a bird in flight, like the pendant he had given her that first Christmas. "To replace the old mark with something new," he explained as they stood together looking out over their land. "Something that represents freedom, not bondage." Penelope touched the pendant she still wore every day. "You gave me that freedom, Roy, when you found me by that stream." He shook his head, pulling her into his arms. "You were already free, Penelope. You freed yourself when you ran. I just helped you stay that way." As twilight settled over Winslow, Colorado, they returned to their home where their children waited, where laughter and love had long since erased the shadows of the past. The brand on Penelope's shoulder would always remain, a reminder of darker days, but it had ceased to define her. Instead, she was defined by the life she had built as a teacher, a mother, a respected member of the community, and above all, as a woman who had claimed her freedom against impossible odds. The cowboy who had once told her, "You're free with me," had given her far more than freedom. He had given her a future where her choices were her own, where love was freely given rather than demanded, and where the scars of the past were simply stories, not shackles. "I love you, Penelope Xavier," Roy whispered as they stepped onto their porch, their home glowing with lamplight behind them. "And I love you," she answered, standing tall and proud beside the man who had seen her worth when she herself had almost forgotten it existed. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have left." In the distance, a shooting star streaked across the Colorado sky, a fleeting reminder that even in darkness, light finds a way to shine. just as Penelope had found her way to freedom to Roy and finally, irrevocably, to herself.